So we explored Sunday the parables of chapter 13, where Jesus lays out kingdom dynamics. I just want to go over those again real quick. Where the parables reveal that a true disciple is somebody who sells everything to acquire the kingdom. And remember, we're talking about filters that we make decisions or live our life through, and that we need to dispel all filters except the one of Jesus Christ and what he teaches us to live out. Certainly the bad things, the temptations we have to seek after, we need to not make choices based on those. But also some good things, the respect of those around us. We can't make decisions based on how we'll gain their respect. We have to make them based on how we gain God's approval. And I don't mean to imply that we have to strive for that. We've been given his love freely. But everything we do is aimed to please him and not others, or not the acquisition of anything, or the giving into sins that are pleasures here on earth. Now, as we talked about that, we know that as we sell everything, the expectation is that we'll grow in good soil and will become fruitful. I want to talk about defining that fruit a little bit more. Because if you're somebody saying, Pastor Rob, I'm trying to discern if I'm being a follower in my life or if I really am being a disciple. Everybody that surrounds me are Christians, so I don't get a lot of flack for what I believe or what I profess. And the gospel tells me I'll receive that if I do live it out. The gospel tells me that I'll have these different struggles, and I'm not having these. So count yourself blessed in that. But sometimes it can be hard to understand. If I go to church on Sundays and I pray, if I give a little bit of time during the week to help with ministry programs, is this the kind of fruit that Jesus is talking about? So let's talk about what that fruit looks like. And this is another challenge. We read the gospel carefully. There are some things that are going to surprise you. And one of the things that will surprise you is that Jesus draws this boundary between what was before the law and what has come after in his ministry. And one of the people caught on the other side of that boundary will be surprising to you. Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 through 6 reads, "When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?'" Now we are getting to the expectation of John's ideal of what the Messiah in the kingdom ought to look like, and what Jesus revealed, and they're not the same. And so this is a surprising revelation when you read through Matthew and you find that Jesus had that clear line. Now, he has some wonderful things to say about John, and we'll get to that in a moment. But John is on the other side of those kingdom people. Here's how Jesus responded. Jesus answered them. So this is our fruit that we should be seeing in our lives. "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." Now, I don't know about you, but I have never given sight to the blind. I've never raised anybody from the dead. I've never cleansed a leper, and I've never helped somebody walk who was lame. Not in the literal sense, of course, and we can do some spiritual gymnastics with that, or to explain that. But one thing we can all do is we can bring the good news to the poor. And we see this throughout Matthew's gospel. Jesus going to the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the outsiders, and drawing them into the kingdom. John's expectation of the kingdom is not seen in those acts. His expectation was the Messiah will come with fire. He's going to cleanse the unrighteous from the house of Israel, which he understood as the scribes and Pharisees, the same way that Jesus confronted them. But John was still looking for an earthly kingdom, a one-upmanship of faith. If you're not faithful to God, you're not going to receive the power that God is bringing to an earthly dominion. And we know that one day that will come, but that is not what the Messiah came and brought and gave us to do. Now, Jesus went on to speak about John the Baptist. As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, see, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. So Jesus is obviously writing John into his narrative. So even though he's on that other side of the kingdom boundary, he's part of that which leads to. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Those who begin to understand the inward transformation that the Messiah calls us to, the upside downness of God's kingdom, are going to be even greater than John the Baptist. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John came. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. So he's saying, if you're willing to accept that I'm the Messiah, the one that comes after Elijah, let anyone with ears hear. But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace, calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. Now here, listen to the distinction between Jesus and John. But they're opposites, but the same. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. So Jesus is saying, living that austere life that John lived, but because he was proclaiming the kingdom, he was rejected. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. And they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. And so Jesus says, you can live the austere Christian life like John did, or you can embrace life the way I did and embrace others. But if you're aiming towards the kingdom, the people in power aren't going to accept it. They aren't going to receive it. So as you're being called to live out your faith, I want to encourage you to read the Gospels closely. They don't always say what we have always assumed they say. And what I mean by we is I just mean us in the last 50, 60 years or last 100 years in the way we read it. Remember that the gospel was written by the marginalized, those on the outside, the least of these. And when you look at the fruit we're called to have, our fruit isn't to be dominant as John was expecting to see in the Messiah, though he did want all these things that Jesus told his disciples to go back and tell him. He expected it to be done in a different way, in a dominant, strong-handed way. But Jesus did it by sacrifice. Again, and I feel like I just keep saying this, but I think it's something that bears repeating in our culture today. He did it by laying down his rights. But not just laying down his rights, but saying, here I am. I love you. I accept you. And you can either receive me or nail me to a cross. And we know what humanity chooses when it faces vulnerability. But we're called to be more than that. We're called to be disciples of Jesus Christ and to live out our faith, even unto death. So what do you need to die to this week to gain more of him? If you remember when John meets Jesus, he says, I must decrease, he must increase. My strength and my might, my strong voice needs to get quieter and quieter as I allow the suffering servant to lead God's people. Amen.